The Populist Delusion by Neema Parvini is a book that aims to explain how power functions in reality. True to the title of the book, Parvini rejects what he calls the Populist Illusion, or the idea that the people are sovereign and their representatives governed by their consent. His thesis is simple. An organized minority always rules over the disorganized majority, and all social change at all times has been top-down and elite-driven, rather than driven by the people. To build his case, Parvini draws upon the knowledge of 8 thinkers and devotes a chapter to each of them and their main ideas. Moreover, he also highlights what he calls the 4 myths of liberalism, which are addressed by several of the thinkers and are therefore stated at the beginning of the book. The 4 myths of liberalism are as follows. 1. The myth of the stateless society, that state and society were or could ever be separate. 2. The myth of the neutral state, that state and politics were or could ever be separate. 3. The myth of the free market, that state and economy could ever be separate. 4. The myth of the separation of powers, that competing power centers can realistically endure without converging. The myth of the stateless society is fundamentally wrong-headed because humans are political animals, and what is called the state is merely an expression of the fact that there must be political function in any society. Thus, a stateless society is nothing but the unattainable dream of anarchists. The myth of the neutral state, likewise, is an impossibility, as there can be no escape from the political if a society has a state. The state will always have to deal with internal and external political questions, regardless of the ruling ideology or class. Thus, a neutral state is impossible. The myth of the free market, much to the chagrin of ANCAPs, is also a fiction. Matters relating to the political, i.e. style of government, who holds sovereignty, etc., take priority over matters relating to the economic, and because of this, the economy is always subordinate to politics. Furthermore, competing power centers will always be incentivized to influence, if not outright manage, the economy. Thus, a free market independent from the tether of politics is a myth. Finally, the myth of the separation of powers is fundamentally wrong-headed due to the tendency of power to centralize. Power may be split among different centers or branches with the intent of creating a system of checks and balances, as had been done in the nascent United States. But over time, it will inevitably consolidate and blur the lines of where one branch's authority ends and another's begins. Even in the United States, a nation with a constitution designed to ensure the separation of powers, power centers converged over time, resulting in what we call the deep state today. Presidents such as Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, and certainly FDR can be pointed to as major consolidators of power, who each, at different points in U.S. history, took a hatchet to the notion of decentralized power. Thus, the separation of powers is merely a fiction. After outlining the 4 myths of liberalism, Parvini proceeds to the first political thinker examined in the book. This is an Italian man named Gaetano Mosca, and his book from which Parvini draws upon is called The Ruling Class. Mosca, who is regarded by many as the father of Italian elite theory, contributes 2 salient ideas to the Populist Delusion, that of the rulers and the ruled and political formulas. The rulers and the ruled refers to Mosca's idea that all societies are divided into 2 classes, an organized minority of rulers and the disorganized masses who are ruled, as Mosca contends in The Ruling Class. In all societies, from all societies that are very meagerly developed and have barely attained the dawnings of civilization, down to the most advanced and powerful societies, 2 classes of people appear, a class that rules and a class that is ruled. The reason Mosca is so adamant on this point has to do with his rejection of the notion of popular sovereignty, or the idea that power rests in the will of the people. As Parvini summarizes, power does not nor will ever rest in the will of the people, but rather in the organized efforts of the ruling minority. But it is worth stressing that Mosca's thesis does not stop here. The elite theorist argument goes beyond merely asserting that a minority always rules the majority, by contending that the more numerous majority cannot control the dominant minority wherever democratic mechanisms are used. As Mosca writes, in elections, as in all other manifestations of social life, Those who have the will, and especially the moral, intellectual, and material means to force their will upon others, take the lead over the others and command them. In case there is still doubt about the truth of Mosca's argument, one needs only to look to the 2016 Democratic primary election to find an example. The socialist Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders had significantly more popular support among left-wing voters than his rival Hillary Clinton, who was extremely unpopular even among liberal circles. Nevertheless, Clinton, who had the backing of well-funded and organized Democratic elites, defeated Sanders in the primary before she went on to lose the general election to Donald Trump. Populist support was in the end no match for the support of wealthy DNC elites, and as a result, Clinton, not Sanders, was the Democratic nominee. Beyond the concept of the rulers and the ruled, Mosca has a second salient idea to take note of, that of political formulas. A political formula, also known as a principle of sovereignty, is the legal and moral basis on which the power of the ruling class rests. Mosca notes as an example the divine right of kings, which served as the political formula for medieval European monarchies. Put another way, a political formula is the explanation for why a particular regime is in power. No ruling class can survive without an effective political formula, and if a new regime eclipses the old, the new elites will institute a new political formula to justify their power. In the United States, the original political formula surrounding the ideas of the Constitution has been replaced by a new political formula surrounding the ideas of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. As a result, ideas held dear in the minds of the Founding Fathers, such as freedom of association, have effectively been criminalized, since freedom of association necessarily entails freedom to discriminate on any basis one desires. Proceeding to the second thinker drawn upon in The Populist Illusion, we come to Vilfredo Pareto. Pareto and Mosca both shared the core ideas of Italian elite theory. However, despite being fellow countrymen and having similar ideas regarding elite theory, Pareto and Mosca hated each other. This is because while Pareto saw himself and Mosca as equals, Mosca, who came first, thought himself to be the father of elite theory. Regardless, Pareto was a prolific writer and thinker, as evidenced by his book from which Parvini draws upon, a massive tome titled The Mind and Society, which has an abridged version called The Compendium of General Sociology. Pareto, like Mosca, rejected popular sovereignty as an explanation for how power functions, and also like Mosca, stratified the ruling class into two subclasses, a governing elite and a non-governing elite. Nevertheless, there are points of differentiation between the two men to note. Firstly, Pareto's analysis of power put a much heavier emphasis on the limitations of economics as well as psychology than Mosca's did. Secondly, Vilfredo Pareto was more value-neutral and amoral in his analysis of power than Mosca. Pareto's salient idea is that of the circulation of elites. In Pareto's view, humans are not rational beings, and rather than being governed by logic, humans are instead governed by instinct. Moreover, Pareto thought that different individuals were predisposed to be governed by different sets of instincts. He lists over 40 archetypes of kinds of people, which he calls residues, and further organizes the residues across 6 classes. While Pareto explains each in autistic detail in his book, for the purposes of The Populist Delusion, Parvini focuses on the first 2 classes, which roughly overlap with Niccolo Machiavelli's analogy of foxes and lions. As Parvini summarizes, Class 1 residues correspond to Machiavelli's foxes, while Class 2 residues correspond to Machiavelli's lions. Foxes are adept at manipulation and manufacturing consent, specialists of persuasion, while lions are adept at the use of force, specialists on coercion. Generally, liberals tend to be predisposed to being the Class 1 residues, while conservatives tend to be of the Class 2, although this is not absolute. After getting through this exposition, Parvini goes on to explain Pareto's actual concept of the circulation of elites. Pareto argued that the character of a society is the character of its elites, and at any given time, the composition of elites may be weighted more towards foxes or more towards lions. As Parvini explains, the cunning foxes retain power for some time by their cleverness in forming coalitions, but force is also an essential exercise of government. Eventually, the more forceful counter-elite of lions, willing to use coercion and violence, capture power from the faint-hearted foxes and impose order and discipline. In time, however, the intellectual incompetence and inflexibility of the lions lend to their gradual decline and the infiltration by the more imaginative foxes. Applying Pareto's idea to the real historical situation we find ourselves in, one could easily make the argument that the United States and Europe have been dominated by foxes since 1945. If Pareto is correct, then the liberal democratic norm of fox governance cannot persist indefinitely, and eventually will give way to a lion-dominated elite class. Only time will tell if this is to be the case. Moving on to the next thinker, Parvini explores the work of the German-born political theorist Robert Michels. Michels was a protege of Gaetano Mosca, served as a mediator for conflicts between Mosca and Pareto, and published his own magnum opus titled Political Parties in 1911. Michels, as a student of Mosca, built upon already established ideas within elite theory. Regarding the impossibility of popular sovereignty, the British author Gordon Hands summarized Michels' line of thinking. The rank and file are manipulated into accepting policies for which they would not otherwise agree, and which are not in their interests, or at least are primarily in the interests of the leadership group. Though Michels took the foundations of elite theory largely for granted, that is not to say he had no serious contributions to the school of thought. Robert Michels' salient idea for which his chapter is titled is called The Iron Law of Oligarchy. As Michels writes in Political Parties, organization implies a tendency to oligarchy. In every organization, whether it be a political party, a professional union, or any other association of any kind, the aristocratic tendency manifests itself very clearly. As a result of organization, every political or professional union becomes divided into a minority of directors and a majority of directed. Michels himself observed this phenomenon firsthand during his time as a member of Germany's Social Democratic Party. The SDP was run by committee and was theoretically democratic and accountable to the will of its constituents. However, Michels quickly learned that such was not the case. In actuality, it was impossible to democratically ask every member of the SDP what course of action should be taken, and the responsibility of decision-making fell on the shoulders of party leadership. The party leadership frequently reneged on its policy promises to SDP members and maintained their positions of power, despite betraying the masses of SDP voters. Noticing this pattern re-emerge over and over, led Michels to become disillusioned with democracy and set him on the path of learning how power actually functions. Michels' claim was not only that the iron law of oligarchy exists, but that it exists at all levels, whether the organization is a party, club, church, city, nation, tribe, empire, and so on. To buttress his claim, Michels identified 5 factors for why the iron law is true, 2 psychological and 3 practical. 1. The masses have a psychological need to be led. They are predisposed to manipulation by skilled leaders who take advantage of their tendency to react emotionally as opposed to rationally. Because of this, masses of people will consolidate around a director, even if that person does not have their best interests at heart. 2. The allure of power motivates a director to consolidate power around himself. As Lord Acton's adage goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Smart leaders desire control much more than they desire money or admiration. Thus, the leader is incentivized to accrue power around himself and his subordinates, as opposed to the disorganized mass. 3. The mechanical reason. When dealing with organizations that number in the thousands or millions, holding a referendum for decision-making is unfeasible for every issue. Thus, decision-making has to fall to a minority of directors. 4. The technical reason. There are innumerable bureaucratic details that need to be attended to if an organization is to survive. Issues such as financial and administrative problems exist across all organizations, and the maintenance of the organization requires work to be done which not every member is willing or able to do. 5. The tactical reason. The masses simply will and cannot organize. For all of these reasons, Michels argues that the iron law of oligarchy is truly iron, and the only way to dislodge leadership from within a party is for a new group of directors to outmaneuver the entrenched leadership and capture their positions. Moving on to the next thinker, Parvini explores the ideas of Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt is particularly interesting because despite him being an avowed National Socialist, even far-left university professors concede he had a solid grasp on the nature of power. Furthermore, Schmitt wrote prolifically on the topic. Parvini cites two works by Carl Schmitt from which he draws upon: Political Theology, published in 1922, and The Concept of the Political, published in 1932. Carl Schmitt has many ideas which are noteworthy, but perhaps two of the most salient are his views on sovereignty and the friend-enemy distinction. Beginning with the former, Schmitt famously stated, "Sovereign is he who decides the exception." The sovereign is not the person who holds a particular title or office, but rather is the person who makes decisions when a political system is under crisis. As Schmitt remarked, all law is situation law. Because the sovereign decides the exception to law, he is not constrained by the law. By Carl Schmitt's definition, U.S. President Donald Trump was never sovereign because he did not decide the exception to the law and was constrained by it. Conversely, his deep state was not, and was able to ignore and lie to the president with impunity, as demonstrated by the State Department's refusal to recall U.S. troops from the Middle East and the impotence of Trump to stop them. While Schmitt's dictum of "sovereign is he who decides the exception" is his most famous idea regarding sovereignty, it is not the only metric Schmitt uses to identify who is sovereign. Also worthy of note is that Carl Schmitt recognizes the sovereign as the person who interprets the political formula. Oftentimes, a political formula is a slogan or otherwise has some degree of vagueness about it. Competing groups within the same political framework may both identify a political formula as that of their society, but nevertheless interpret it differently to coincide with their political agenda. For example, rival princes operating under the divine right of kings political formula might both have claims to the throne, and each will interpret the political formula in a way that supports their claim. In this case, Schmitt would recognize the sovereign as the person who interprets the political formula, whether it be one of the princes themselves, a bishop, the pope, or even a cadre of lords who hold outsized power. The second main idea of Schmitt's is the friend-enemy distinction. Schmitt here refers not to a private enemy within one's personal life, but rather a person or persons who politically advocate against one's political interests. As Parvini writes on the friend-enemy distinction, when friends are in power and imposing their values, that is good. When enemies are in power and imposing theirs, that is bad. This is politics, war by another name. Schmitt correctly observed that neutrality is a lie, and politics is not a marketplace of ideas in which the best ideas win, but rather it is the fighting over who gets to be in charge, with no tactic being too underhanded or distasteful to be used. Moving on to the next thinker, we arrive at Bertrand de Jouvenel in his seminal work titled On Power. De Jouvenel as a writer was lauded in France, but perhaps because he published On Power in 1945 and was a critic of democracy, the English-speaking world largely neglected his work. Nevertheless, despite not gaining the widespread readership he deserved, de Jouvenel still provides many worthwhile insights in his book On Power. The concepts of the high-low middle and political castles are particularly salient, along with his criticisms of democracy. De Jouvenel's main idea for which his chapter is titled is called the high-low middle model. High-low middle essentially refers to the idea that the high, or central sovereign power, will ally with the low, or the proletariat, against the middle, who consist of the middle class, non-governing aristocrats, kulaks, small businesses, etc. Parvini notes that the best way to know who counts as part of the middle is that the high must consider it as a rival and thus a potential threat to its power. The high does not consider the unwashed masses comprising the low as a serious threat, but does perceive the middle as a sort of aristocracy, which does not need the state in the same way that the proletariat masses do. By telling the low that it is the middle who is responsible for oppressing them, as well as by making promises to guarantee the liberty and security of the low, the high protects itself from being eclipsed by rival power centers within the middle. This brings us neatly to de Jouvenel's second salient concept, that of political castles. These rival power centers, of which the high are afraid, are examples of castles. A castle may be an institution, a part of the state apparatus, a social media platform, a politically influential corporation, or any other node with some intrinsic power in society. Like a physical castle, these power centers can be captured and then may be used to further an agenda. A relatively recent example of a castle being captured was when SpaceX CEO Elon Musk bought the social media platform Twitter. Before Musk took over the castle of Twitter, it was ruled by the likes of Parag Agrawal and Yoel Roth, who ran the platform in a manner that the high wished them to. Musk, who himself notably is not a right-winger, nevertheless upset the high by removing Agrawal and his ilk from the administration of the castle. Now, Twitter is decidedly more friendly to opponents of the high than it was during the reign of Parag Agrawal. As such, this constitutes an example of castle capture. The next thinker discussed by Parvini is James Burnham, author of The Machiavellians and the Managerial Revolution. Interesting to note is that Burnham started out as an avowed Trotskyist, but eventually abandoned Marxism, much to the chagrin of his socialist contemporaries. Burnham also had profoundly influenced George Orwell, and it is said that he was the inspiration for Orwell's character O'Brien in 1984, due to his coldly Machiavellian outlook on the nature of power. Burnham's most famous book is The Managerial Revolution, published in 1941, and it was truly well ahead of its time. Burnham's thesis was that the Marxists were wrong. While there was indeed a global revolution taking place against capitalism, it was not the proletariat who were overthrowing the bourgeoisie. Rather, a new class, the managerial class, was on the rise and would come to prominence. Moreover, in Burnham's analysis, the managerial class would operate across the public-private divide in every large organization in society. To quote Burnham, "In the new form of society, sovereignty is localized in administrative bureaus. They proclaim the rules, make the laws, and issue the decrees. The shift from parliament to bureaus occurs on a world scale. The actual directing and administrative work of the bureaus is carried on by a new man, a new type of men. It is specifically the managerial type." As previously mentioned, however, the managerial class is not solely limited to government bureaucrats. The managerial class also exists in the private sector and in institutions. Burnham distinguished the two as managers in government and managers in industry. To quote, "The active heads of the bureaus are the managers in government, the same or nearly the same in training, functions, skills, and habits of thought as the managers in industry." Importantly, Burnham foresaw the divorce of power from ownership and the rise of public corporations as opposed to private ones. In the first half of the 20th century, capitalists such as Henry Ford or John D. Rockefeller held profound power over their enterprises. Today, as Burnham predicted, the capitalists have seen their power eroded. The most massive companies today are not privately owned by one man and his family like they had been. Instead, going public means that corporations now have CEOs and boards who answer to shareholders, and thus the capitalist class today do not possess power over their companies the way a Ford or a Rockefeller had. Some critics of Burnham, particularly his socialist critics, rejected the claim that capitalism was distinct from managerialism. To this point, Burnham noted several differences. Firstly, in capitalism, the pursuit of profit is the goal of a tycoon, while in managerialism, managers are more concerned with perpetuating and justifying their power than they are with the economic well-being of their company or institution. Put another way, a manager in a company would use his power to make decisions that advance himself, even if making that decision negatively impacts the business. Contrast this with a capitalist, whose desire for profit causes his interests to be aligned with the economic interests of his company, unlike a manager. Secondly, individual managers are replaceable in a way that the capitalist owners were not. A manager is akin to a cog in a machine, whereas a capitalist in charge of his own enterprise is not. Both can be ousted from their positions, but ousting a manager is much easier because a new manager can take his place at any time. A capitalist is not fungible in this way. Removing a tycoon from his company would cause considerable disarray and may even collapse the enterprise. This incentivizes managers to act more as a class and not like competing individuals, which is precisely how rival capitalists see each other. Thirdly, the managerial class is hostile to democracy in a way that the capitalist class was not. This is not to say that the managerial class opposes democracy through rhetoric. In fact, they pay lip service to democracy nearly at every turn because it is in their benefit to do so. Rather, the point is that the managerial class's power increases as the power of the voters, consumers, business owners, and stockholders decreases. As a final note on James Burnham, it is worth recalling Pareto's Class 1 and Class 2 residues. The nature of managerialism selects for foxes to become members of the managerial class. Since 1941, when Burnham wrote The Managerial Revolution, the power of the capitalist class has waned, and with it, the composition of lions in the elite class. Burnham foresaw the rise of fox managers and the declining number of natural leaders within the elite class, far before any of his contemporaries did. But like de Juvenal, Burnham also understood that over-reliance on soft power by managerial elites could not go on indefinitely. Eventually, a crisis would call for the exercising of hard power by the managerial class, and if the managerial class is unable to rely on their preferred techniques, they could be prone to making mistakes. Today, over 80 years after his book was published, the managerial class has more power than ever, but suffers from a severe internal competency crisis. The caliber of managers have degraded considerably from the era of Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann. Only time will tell if poor management by the elites of the West will result in their downfall, or if the lions will continue to lay dormant. Moving on to the next thinker, Parvini explores the ideas of Samuel Francis, author of Leviathan and Its Enemies. Francis was a student of James Burnham and, like his mentor, thought that society was undergoing the managerial revolution. While Burnham wrote in 1941 before the transition from capitalism to managerialism was complete, wrote Leviathan and Its Enemies decades later when managerial control was more noticeable. Francis's salient idea has to do with the role of elites' ideology and how it is used for social control. Recall how Burnham distinguished between two types of managers in government and managers in industry. Sam Francis adds a third category responsible for controlling public opinion and manufacturing consent. He calls this third category mass public relations, but the term managers in media works just as well. Francis's claim was that these managerial elites do not believe in their ideology, but nevertheless work to ensure its total dominance over opposing ideas and narratives, and will stop at nothing until total social control is achieved. Indeed, when Francis says total social control, he is not being hyperbolic. It is the raison d'etre of the managers in media. Parvini invokes 3 examples to prove Francis's point. In America, statues of the Founding Fathers are torn down and vandalized with impunity, while statues of Martin Luther King Jr. increasingly dot the capitals of every state. In 2020, after the Black Lives Matter riots following the death of George Floyd, he too received statues. Even in Britain, a country which Floyd had never set foot in, Edinburgh University's David Hume Tower was renamed to 40 George Square, due to the Scottish philosopher's alleged racist views. Furthermore, in 2020, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, the scientist who invented 9 mRNA vaccine patents with over 12,000 scientific citations, Dr. Robert Malone, was banned from YouTube and Twitter for opposing the mainstream approved narrative surrounding the vaccine, despite nearly 16,000 doctors publicly agreeing with him. Francis would claim that the managers do not believe in the religion of George Floydism, but rather see it as a useful mechanism of cementing their power. Likewise, the managerial elites do not care whether Dr. Robert Malone had the truth on his side or not. Banning his speech was necessary to achieve total social control. In light of these examples, it is apt to end the analysis of Francis with a quote from Leviathan and Its Enemies. As Samuel Francis observed, the formal mechanisms of mass liberal democracy, regular elections, competing political parties, universal suffrage, and legal and political rights do not significantly mitigate the monolithic and uniform concentration of managerial power. The final thinker which Parvini analyzes in The Populist Illusion is the Jewish political scholar and author of Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt, Paul Gottfried. Paul Gottfried is uniquely worthy of distinction in minds of individuals on the right due to his willingness to scorn anti-white political endeavors by minority groups, as Gottfried writes about Jewish groups who weaponize social justice against whites. But seeking out bloc alliances with blacks and other marginalized groups is thought to help American Jews in another, more significant way. Like gays and feminists, blacks are valuable for those who perceive the white Christian right as their major enemy and the prime source of American anti-Semitism. Racist, theocracy, Holocaust denier, and anti-abortion are becoming interchangeable terms in American Jewish tirades against the Christian right. Remaining firmly tied to blacks, therefore, is seen as necessary to preserve Jews against the real enemy, the one they fear and detest most, whether or not it poses a real threat to their individual or communal existence. In Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt, Gottfried argues that since the 1960s, social engineering programs have been put in place to promote diversity and egalitarianism in the predominantly white United States and Europe, but no such social engineering has been foisted on Israel or other non-white countries by NGOs and special interest groups. Furthermore, Gottfried is deeply bothered by the practice of treating dissent as a form of mental illness. By pathologizing any views that stand in opposition to the managerial ideology, dissidents are seen as diseased and in need of intervention to eradicate the sickness inside of them. Science, particularly the fields of psychiatry and medicine, is then subverted and weaponized to first crush wrongthink and second, to accrue more power in the managerial institutions. As Gottfried writes, the political class has adopted inclusiveness and diversity as a political instrument, as a means of controlling a society. It has set about reshaping. The diversity machine is a mechanism of state power that operates without anyone being permitted notice its coercive nature. Gottfried's observation of noticing its coercive nature being verboten is especially noteworthy. Anyone who does point out the insidiousness of pathologizing wrongthink and weaponizing medicine is themselves committing wrongthink and also in need of behavioral modification. Moreover, they are in need of behavioral modification not by the barrel of a rifle, but instead by science-backed experts who coincidentally agree with the regime. Hence, Parvini's apt name for the title of the chapter, The Therapeutic State. In conclusion, the Populist Delusion lays out the case for why, as Parvini states, democracy is and always has been an illusion, in which the true functioning of power, where an organized minority elite rule over a disorganized mass, is obscured through a lie that the people are sovereign. From it, we learn about what Parvini calls the 4 myths of liberalism and why they are wrong. From Mosca, we learn about the concepts of the rulers and the ruled and political formulas. From Pareto, we learn about the circulation of elites. From Michel's, we learn about the iron law of oligarchy. From Carl Schmidt, we learn about the nature of sovereignty and the friend-enemy distinction. From de Juvenel, we learn about high-low-middle and political castles. From James Burnham, we learn about managerialism. From Samuel T. Francis, we learn about the elite's ideology as it relates to social control. And from Paul Gottfried, we learn about the therapeutic state. All of these ideas combined equip the reader with the tools needed to see how power functions in reality and act accordingly. For this reason, the Populist Illusion is required reading for any individual who seeks to restore the West.